Happy Friday, everyone. I'm Bandish, founder of The Curious Mindset, a private community for technology leadership teams powered by 64Tech, an IT solutions provider across hardware, cloud, IT services, data, and AI. Now, while 64Tech powers us, the heart of the community is simple. We always give more than we take. There's no membership fees, no sales pitches, and no pressure. Please do follow our 64Tech LinkedIn page for updates. And if a partnership with 64Tech could support your tech team, or if you're ready to shake things up with your IT suppliers, please use the Calendly link below to book a Zoom with me. But here's the truth. The hardest part of leading a technology department isn't the technology, it's the people. There's so much pressure to look like we have all the answers, but that same pressure can stop us from getting the help that we need. That's why the Curious Mindset community was created. For new members joining us today, this is a space where coaching, mentorship, and community come together, combining practical support with shared experience to help technology leaders grow. We focus on three things: individual impact, helping you grow as a leader, especially if you're leading without much support or don't have someone to turn to in your role. Secondly, team impact, giving you tools to build stronger teams. And community, connection with others on the same journey. Now, this all started from my own experience. I know how tough leadership can be, and I didn't want others to go through it alone. That's why this isn't a podcast, it's a community. And we built this community on three guiding principles: our North Star, no one leads alone; our mantra, together we grow; and our mission, to help technology leaders become the best versions of themselves. Before we dive in, a quick favor. This community grows through invitation and reputation. And the challenge, most tech leaders don't realize they need this until they experience it. So if you believe in what we're building, you can help us in three ways. Stay connected with us, hit the bell on our LinkedIn page so you never miss any future posts. Show your support, leave a Google review and a LinkedIn recommendation, and please spread the word. Invite any tech leaders in your network using our website form or forward Bryony's email. In return, my commitment is this: together with the team, we'll keep making this better fortnight after fortnight. We'll listen to your feedback and shape this around what matters to you the most. Now, before I introduce today's speakers, a big update from us. Our community, which has also been active on Slack, I can hear the virtual cheers already, is now moving to WhatsApp. This will make it easier to stay connected and join conversations. Inside there, you'll find groups for our upcoming events, our book club, and more. Please message Bryony and she'll share the invitation link. She'll also make sure that the right people are joining so the community stays focused and valuable for all of us. Thank you. Now it's my pleasure to introduce today's speakers, our resident host, Andy McMenemy, for our Q&A, our technology leader co-host, Steve Maxwell, and our special guest, Lena Reinhard.
Bandish, thank you so much for that lovely introduction to the session, and thank you for your continued support via 64Tech. It's fair to say everybody knows without your generosity and without 64Tech supporting, the Curious Mindset couldn't exist in its current format, and we couldn't welcome amazing speakers like the one we have today, the very wonderful Lena Reinhard, who's going to help us demystify the subject of debugging your boss. So how can tech leaders learn to manage up? How can they reduce friction? And how can they create alignment at the same time as developing confidence in the way they interact with their bosses? Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to introduce the very wonderful Lena Reinhard.
Hello.
Lena,
I'm very happy to be here, and excellent German pronunciation, Andy.
It's wonderful to have you here today in the Curious Mindset, and we're fascinated to hear this subject. I know it will resonate with nearly every one of our tech leaders.
I will say, as someone who's had many bosses in my own career, and I've probably also not been the perfect boss for everyone who's worked with for me. Just to put that on the table as well. It's a topic that's really near and dear to me, and I know something that a lot of people honestly also get anxious about, and maybe ideally we can help you, spend a bit less anxiety over the weekend this time on how to work with your boss next week.
Well, I have a lot of those themes in common with you because I don't think I've always been the best boss either when I was back in those days. So that's a really nice question for us to lead into the session, Lena. What are the common challenges then that tech leaders, from your experience, face in relationship building with their bosses?
So just to briefly set context on sort of what my experience is, because that might be helpful for all of you who are here. I've worked with teams, distributed teams, predominantly for the last 15 years now, some of them also co-located. My career spans 20 years, and my clients and companies I've worked with have been largely in the Northern Hemisphere, so from Asian countries, Australia is the southern exception, and then largely Europe as well as the US. That's the cultural context that I'm coming from that also informs a lot of this, because like the way that we deal with bosses is often informed by our upbringing. Like I grew up in German work culture where people have a very strict separation between personal and private and personal and work life, which also means that things like being friends with your boss is really uncommon here. Obviously, like painting very broad strokes with these cultural things, that's always important to highlight, and those things have shifted a little bit as well over the years. But then I've also worked with many clients in the US where things like going to your boss's house for a barbecue over the weekend can happen, and so like that upbringing and context do something. For example, for me it meant that I was very intimidated by bosses for a long time and would like never challenge them or give them really open feedback. Another factor is often that there are a lot of stereotypes about bosses. Like the whole like I hate my boss thing is a cliche that everyone knows who enters the workplace, and that also does something. These biases don't necessarily have to show up, but they can be a factor. Even things like pop culture cliches or the way that bosses are depicted in movies, TV shows, can have some influence there. Another thing that I've seen show up quite often is history. So people who have worked with difficult bosses in the past or had troubles in those relationships can sometimes carry that like those issues over with them, and it made make them more suspicious or a bit more terrified of challenging bosses in the future. And then lastly, there's also like how is your work environment? So how do you work with your current boss? What's your relationship? Do you feel actually like you can bring up feedback with them? Is there a supportive environment around you in terms of people who actually make sure that there are processes in place for you to challenge your boss, for example? So there's a multitude of factors, and I think it's really important. So I'm sure all of you are familiar with the iceberg model, but like there are a lot of things that are quite easily visible, like opinions that your boss has or that you have where you disagree or agree. But then the further, like the deeper you go, the more you also realize that there are a lot of things under the surface that can be factors, even just changes in the company that are going on that you're not aware of yet, but that are impacting how your boss is acting now, or like your boss's personality, your own personality, relationship to risk, the financial situation, or even global supply chain issues. So there's a whole range of things that can impact this, and even if you don't know all of them, it's just important to keep in mind it's just a really complex topic, which makes it extra hard, sadly.
Lena, we could spend all afternoon talking about just those,
Oh
right?
yeah, yeah.
But the audience today, for sure, I know some of them work for American-based companies, Canadian-based companies, and some of them have responsibilities across the whole of Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. So I've got two questions, I think, which would help us to understand much better how we can do this. First of all, are there any cultural elements that are slightly different when we think about this process of managing upwards? And also, are there any scientific bases that cover all of them to give us a theme that we can use as an anchor?
And so for the cultural part, my main call out would be just watch out for the work culture that you're operating in. That means there are areas, for example, I've worked with some clients in Japan or even in Vietnam, for example, where challenging your boss quite openly or directly is just unheard of, and where it's really not a thing that you can do. There are other areas like some US companies, for example, that at least say or purport that you should challenge your boss, you should really have open discussions with them where there's some tension built into the relationship. If you're not entirely sure, what the work culture is in your company, or how to navigate it, I'd always recommend check with your colleagues. And another piece that can always give valid information or important information on that is your company's performance review process. Like, what are the feedback questions that are, are you being asked questions about your boss's performance? What are those questions? What behaviors or characteristics are you being asked about there? That can be a really good source of information. And for the second question on the scientific basis, so I like to, wherever possible, approach these kind of leadership and management discussions with what's the research, because I have a lot of opinions and I will share them today as well. But many of those are grounded, not just in my experiences, but also in the research. The current, obviously there's also scientific discussion about that, but the currently sort of established theory is called leader-member exchange. The idea that a productive relationship between an employee and a boss is based in kind of 4 key factors. The one is ultimately deliver results, and those results are done well. You're aligned, you're autonomous, and you're also accountable towards one another. So it's not just a one-way street. Each of you works at the appropriate levels for their role, and it's a motivating relationship. So it's pretty simple. There's good research on that. I recommend to read up on that a bit more if you're interested. But yeah, that's what a lot of what we'll talk about today, I think, is grounded in as well.
Lovely. So what are the common themes then that we find tech leaders challenged with or struggling with when it comes to this process of managing up and building that alignment?
I mean, first piece is just I hate my boss or I, dislike them. The second, I think, is I don't know where I stand. So being unsure about either expectations or how well one is even doing their job. A big piece is often also like I don't know how to. I have things to say to my boss and I don't know how to tell them. So things that aren't going well either in the collaboration, partnership with them, or in the company surrounding them. Or the bigger piece, like I don't know how growth or success or whatnot looks like in this company overall.
And is that something that is, again, a cross-cultural thing, or is that just something that we're showing up as a number of themes?
I would say that holds across culture. Like I would generally say that like challenges in working with bosses are pretty universal. The main difference in kind of cultural challenges is one, like how much are people actually feeling that? In areas where people are just where challenging your boss or giving them critical feedback isn't really an option. It's just not something that people think about because there's not much that they can do anyway. Or if they think about it, the main option they may have is just changing jobs at some point. So I think the overall themes in terms of like there's a person who has power over me, which is ultimately what this boils down to, and that's also why I like to talk about bosses in this context, not about leaders. We're specifically talking about a reporting relationship. You work for someone who will deliver your performance review. If there is such thing in your company, they are responsible for how much you're getting paid. They're also the person who can say at any point that you don't have a job anymore. And so that power dynamic is really the huge marker, and what makes this a challenging relationship.
And would you find that more typically in companies that have this kind of power over people mentality in the business, or is it more about empowering people? What's your take on that?
I think it's a great question. I would say it exists in all cases.
Hmm.
The big question is just how visible it is. Like in companies that have a much more hierarchical approach, where the participation of employees, for example, is not as encouraged as much or whatnot. The power dynamic is quite visible typically and quite clear. So people like, no, here's my boss, here's the power they have over me. In companies that like there are obviously extremes, like companies that have a very, very flat structure, that have, no titles, things like that. Those kinds of things still exist. They just get much muddier and often much harder to navigate, because in those cases, power just gets established in different ways. For example, through the experience that someone has, the tenure in the company, the relationships they have with important people, the name they've made for themselves through important releases, for example. And so, and in addition to that, there's usually still someone who can say that you're going to be fired one day. So that also is still a thing. But that also means when those relationships are less obviously hierarchical or less by the definition hierarchical, that doesn't mean they're not there.
Sure. And where do you feel the responsibility lies with a boss to inspire their team as opposed to manage them?
So I would, in the way that I work, I like to really make a clear distinction between management, and that's where I would put being a boss, and leadership. Like ideally, we need leaders, we need people who inspire people, empower people, set a vision. Like ultimately, I like to use the definition of like managing as being about like handling like just tasks. It's a quite operational function,
The
whereas
processes and
leadership is much
transactions,
more
yeah.
about, yes, exactly. Leadership being much more about ambiguity, change, inspiration, empowerment. And so ultimately, yes, I would like a lot, like all bosses and managers to be leaders, but at the same time, leadership tends to be such an extremely, one, ambiguous term, two, also one that gets thrown around way too much and has become very, very blurry at this point. And at least for myself, I also define it as something aspirational. Like I aspire to be a leader. I aspire to utilize, exhibit the behaviors that come with being a good leader. But at the same time, it's also something that I don't think is ever really done because it's an ongoing process. And I do think, and that's probably one of my first hot takes here, but I do think because of a huge focus on leadership in tech and specifically a huge focus in the discussions that we have about like technology and the people who have very big roles and big names in it, that get associated with leadership. I think the discourse has not paid enough attention to management because management is the stuff that pretty much everyone who works in this industry gets confronted with every day. It's again like it's the performance reviews, it's the one-on-ones, it's the mundane feedback and the getting stuff done. And there's been really an underinvestment in people being good managers. And yes, again, ideally we have both. But in the first place, I would love to see just more good bosses and more good managers who are handling the day-to-day well and who are a bit less preoccupied with becoming the great next thought leaders in our industry and just instead focus on treating their employees well.
That's a great point. And I guess it's fair to say that most people find themselves in their first role of responsibility because they're very good technically and competent in their role, right? And then
Mm.
they get promoted and they get given responsibility for people. But that's a completely different skill
It's
set.
very unfortunate, yeah.
Yeah, it's a
Yeah.
completely different skill set. And without having some transitional training to enable them to be able to feel comfortable stepping into that role of now managing other people,
Mhm.
it can be quite stressful, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's a step to the side. It's not a growth path, but it's a side step into, as you said, into a completely different role set with different skills needed and with completely different success criteria. And the part that's been really kind of saddening almost for me over the last couple of years has been this regression that we've seen in that direction. It's obviously a much larger context, but a lot of companies have now moved back to promoting people just purely for technical skills. And I don't want to discount that many of those people, I'm sure, have great capacity and potential as managers, but they don't have the experience necessarily. And also requiring a lot more hands-on work again in these roles, all of which means that like operational work suffers, the operational work of just running a team well and helping them deliver well. The leadership aspect like, is definitely also going to suffer, and it doesn't set up those people for success. And that's the part that really saddens me the most in it, because it's going to create another generation of managers who hate their jobs because the job is not designed well. And it's really difficult to really be good at it.
And I guess there's a degree of them not feeling like they're being supported in that role, right? That because that transitional training may not be there. I mean, we like to think as we progress that our boss will have all of the knowledge and experience that we are now responsible for, and that they should guide us and they should lead us in the way of sharing their knowledge, right?
hmm
But
And I
that
think
doesn't often
that's, yeah.
happen.
No, exactly. And I think I'm glad you're bringing that up because I think it's a really common fallacy. Like I work with so many people who do so much hard work into being good managers and leaders. Um, and at the same time, I think, by the way, one piece that I kind of neglected in the definitions is that roles like a tech lead, for example, which are typically called just a lead role, who don't have personnel responsibility, but they're still obviously really important as part of this whole conversation, because they still have some power through, for example, the experience that they bring. Yeah, just worth mentioning. Um, and I've lost my train of thought.
That's
Sorry.
okay. We were talking about that role where the tech lead, for example, who doesn't have responsibility for people. but
Yes.
also we were expecting our bosses to be able to mentor
Yes.
or guide
Thank
us
you.
because
Yes. I'm back on it. Got it. Thanks. Yeah, and so there's a lot of people who put into a lot of work into being good bosses, but who kind of more or less explicitly hope to get the same from their bosses, but don't necessarily know what their boss is actually dealing with in their day-to-day work, how much they have on their plate, or even their background, or how they actually lead. And so even that can be a huge setup for disappointment. Now, I don't think you should have a low bar or low standard for your boss, but the amount of care that you may be able to give to a team or to a domain versus what they're able to give to you just may not be the same, which is unfortunate, but often part of the equation.
sure. So when we think about the process then of managing up in any of those scenarios, and we think about trying to reduce our own personal stress, trying to maybe create some alignment and find some confidence, what advice can you give us in those areas from your research that you feel would help our tech leaders today?
I think based on the work that I've done with a lot of leaders on this, I usually approach it in two areas. The one is yourself. So, like you just alluded to, what are the things that you can control, where you can actively take some steps, and that involves like how you show up in your work, what you deliver, what you get done, how you own things, how you communicate with your boss. Maybe even to a degree, like there's obviously debates about how much control we have over our feelings, but that's also an important factor in this. And then the second piece is like your boss. They're not the person you can change necessarily. I think that's an important underlying assumption here. As much as, at least I will admit, I have many times just wished to make significant personality changes to some of the people I worked with. But that's, I don't have the tools for that, full disclosure. But so what are things that you can do in relation to them in terms of how you understand them, what you expect from them, how you broach the relationship with them? Those are the two big areas that I found really useful to focus on, and where it's possible to make changes. I think that's an important thing to call out here. Like, it is a big topic, it's complicated, it also sucks sometimes, but there are material things that you can do, and honestly, everyone I've worked with on this has managed to make a difference for themselves in it. That's important to call out here.
So
It's
what,
not as dire as it sounds.
no, that's great. But what practical tools can we use then?
Well, I think we can spend the next like half hour on this technically. So where would you like to start?
Oh, I guess anywhere that's it's all relevant, right? It's all relevant for us today.
Yes, I think the first piece that I'd start with then is know yourself. There's like all of us, and I will say I've been in the workplace for 20 years now. Some of those things took me way too long to get to, but all of us have some mechanisms that we default to. Like I mentioned earlier, I used to be super afraid of bosses. I would struggle with challenging them. That's something that I've been working on, and it will be a perpetual thing for me to work on for the rest of my career because it's just not something that I'm inclined to do. And so, what are the things that, like, for example, how do you react to criticism that you receive? Do you always get defensive? Do you engage with it? Be honest with yourself with this, because you're not doing yourself a favor if you're just like, oh yeah, like I take criticism super well, and then actually you don't. Like I mentioned earlier, what experiences have you had with bosses in the past? Are there things that you really dislike about your current boss? Maybe you think they're incompetent, they don't actually know what they're doing, or you hate how they give you feedback, whatever it is. So yourself, similarly, what work culture did you come up in? How has that shaped you? And then repeat that regularly. But I think even just doing it once will be a really like important piece. The second part as a foundation that really anyone can do is know what you can expect of your boss. Because you may have an idealized version of a boss who's supportive and caring and really invested in your career and growth, or whatever that looks like. But then there's also the boss who you currently have. And short of like starting a coup, you may not be able to get rid of them, or getting a new job, obviously. But so know your boss. What do they value? Like you can even like I've done entire profiles on bosses with people, so you can go really wild on this. But think about things like what do they value? how do they like to communicate? You can even ask them those things directly. That can be quite interesting. Look at, what are things that you see in their job description about how they should perform. Like I mentioned earlier, performance review questions that you're getting about them. Or even things that are less about, long-term things or deeper things, but very current, like what problems do they actually care about right now? Maybe you've been trying to pitch an initiative for weeks or months and getting frustrated because your boss doesn't care. And well, turns out they have very different fish to fry and something that's much more important to the business where your dream initiative just isn't relevant. And so even these questions that are much more current, like what problems are on their mind, what questions do they get from stakeholders, what things are they concerned about, like revisit those regularly because it's going to change. And it's going to give you a lot of really important signal about your boss and what really matters to them that you can then use to base your approaches on.
And do you recommend any kind of behavioral profiling tools like there's Belbin, there's Myers-Briggs. I use Clarity 4D because it's very nice at helping people to understand it in plain language, to be able to understand ourselves better first of all, and what our preferences are and our styles of communication, for example, but then also to be able to communicate with our boss in the way that they like to be communicated with, right?
So I've made good experiences with the Gallup Strength Finder. I don't recommend Myers-Briggs just because the aforementioned scientific foundation. But Strength Finder is useful. It's a tool that basically focuses on looking at, again, what strengths do people have? It can be a really valuable foundation for conversation as a team. Ideally, for example, your boss and then your peers would be involved, and it can be a really just good way to engage on that. Otherwise, I haven't used a lot of tools on that other than the stakeholder power interest matrix is what it's called. It's a really good tool, but that goes a bit broader beyond bosses specifically. The main tool, honestly, because I know that it's also easy to get bogged down in like tool research on those things. If you can have a conversation with them and try and genuinely understand them better as a person. I've used with some people what I like to describe as the investigative journalist hat, where you just look at them with a very curious mind and try and put aside, past feelings or kind of issues you may have with them as much as that's possible, and just try and understand better how they actually work, instead of kind of, frustrations or idealized versions kind of overshadowing those things.
And I guess it's fair to say that we recognize the pressure we're under in these types of roles. And obviously, our boss will have responsibilities that are more than ours and under equal levels of pressure. I suppose appreciating the fact that they may be stressed and they may be, reacting in ways that if they weren't under that kind of pressure, they wouldn't react, right? But it's our responsibility to manage up that. It's our responsibility to be able to communicate well with them.
Yeah, and I think it's an important piece in this, and it's also a part that's really difficult to navigate because ultimately the accountability is messed up in that relationship. Like, I have worked with people who have like issues with their bosses that all go into like what I'd call HR relevant or code of conduct relevant territory, where we're talking about discrimination, harassment, and things like that. Those issues also exist. That's not the focus of our conversation today, but I just want to call it out. There often aren't good mechanisms in place for handling those things when they're originating from bosses, which is terrible and puts a lot of employees into really bad positions. But that also means there isn't a good mechanism to hold your boss accountable, whereas they can fire you. And so that kind of unevenness in the dynamic makes it really hard. And at the same time, like you said, they may have a bad day or they may have a stressful time that they're going through. And so I think it's very difficult, and it's also something where like, self-managing and figuring out where your boundaries in terms of what you're able to handle is really important, because ultimately, like, you may be able to tell them that the way that their stressful time is showing up for you is not great, but you may also not be able to do that, and that's just a really difficult position to hold.
So for some of our leaders that are maybe newly appointed into roles of responsibility, or maybe don't feel as confident as they would like to feel, what are some tips and techniques we can share then, Lena, which may help people to build confidence in those areas? What have you found through your research or through personal experience that helps someone to lift their confidence when it comes to this area of having those challenging conversations?
I think another really important foundation that can be a huge asset here is like putting in the work to really understand what's expected of you. Because in a lot of tech companies, it's been my experience, that's just often really hard to understand. Either job descriptions are too abstract, or you're the first person in a certain role, or just no one really knows what success looks like. That's what it boils down to. And so even things like, what is your role description? If there isn't one in place, write one, get feedback from your boss. The second piece that I've found really useful over the years is thinking about and asking about what is your function? And your function in the sense of, like, yes, your role exists. There's something about, you probably help the team deliver better, or just, get stuff done for the business. But your function, sort of in the systems theory context, so the idea is that it's ultimately the thing that you're really there to do. So for example, for senior people or even for leaders, that's often like filling some gaps or triaging and prioritizing work, or like I've run a lot of product engineering organizations. In that case, my function was often balancing a good tension between like investments that we need on the engineering side for scalability with forward-looking things for more immediate business impact from our customer side. And so that function is often can be a bit tricky to get to, but something like, asking yourself, what is your real job? What are you really here for? What is the really most important thing for the business? Or what would fall apart if you weren't there? Can be really helpful in a way to get to that. Or things like, get feedback from people. A lot of people don't get a lot of feedback from their bosses, which is often a huge part of this problem. Ask them very regularly. Like, make a reminder for yourself, ask them every 2 weeks in your one-on-one. Or if, what feedback do you have for me? If that doesn't work, ask them for advice. Like, what's your advice? Or what could I do to get 10% better? And similarly, get feedback from your peers as well. So there's a big piece in like gathering information that will help you establish more of a sense of how you're doing and maintaining that over time, which can be really useful.
Lena, in your roles where you were, leading significant teams and had significant responsibility, when you looked at the people that stood out for you or shone, if you like, when you look at them, what qualities did you admire in those people that reached out to you, and how did they do that?
So a big piece is ownership. That's something that a lot of bosses look for. And ownership in the sense of taking on responsibility, taking on like seeing things through, following through on commitments, maybe sometimes also volunteering for stuff, even though that doesn't even have to be it. But putting yourself out there, and very actively communicating. It's like, I know proactive is really like such an overused buzzword because it's also so like such a double whammy, but like really actively communicating with your boss, like, where are things at? What are the risks? What do you see on the horizon that's kind of looming, and what do you need from them? Like, very basic things, but that level of ownership is something that honestly, like, I would like try and exhibit with my own bosses, and also something that I really try to foster with the people reporting to me, because the crucial piece that I found is that most bosses don't really mind when stuff goes wrong, because everyone knows that like it's business, like stuff, like nothing will ever be perfect. But they need to know, and they need to know quickly. And so when you take that ownership piece, and you feel responsible for the things that you're taking on, and you let them know when things are either, at risk of going off track, or like something went wrong, like they will be able to handle it. Obviously, when that stuff starts piling up, that's a different conversation. But that's much easier than sort of trying to keep things from them or shield them. But instead, building an open relationship will also just help with building a lot of trust over time.
So I guess I'm hearing have the confidence to ask questions,
Mm-hmm.
have the curiosity to understand what's going on in their world, in your boss's world, if you like, and where possible, if you feel like you'd like to have more responsibility, make sure you're asking for it. Make sure they are aware that you are willing to put your hand up and take on responsibility, right?
Yeah, I would, even though as a prerequisite to that, I would say do your job,
Yeah.
and do your job properly. Because one of the things that a lot of bosses tell me, and that honestly I would also raise my eyebrows at, is people asking for more responsibility who don't have their bases covered.
Sure.
And so that's where, like, knowing what's expected of you, what success looks like, and then making sure that your boss agrees that you're actually doing a good job, will be really important. yeah, otherwise completely agree.
And were you fortunate always to work in businesses that gave you regular one-to-ones so that you gained that feedback? Because I know from some of the clients I've had a conversation with, some of the teams I've had a conversation with, that, you know, they don't often get one-to-one feedback. Sometimes they get one face-to-face meeting a year with the boss.
Yeah, I will say, like I've been in tech for 15 years now, and like I've had one-to-ones for a big part of that time. Have I had useful one-to-ones for the majority of that time? No. Like my sense is that even when one-to-ones happen, they're just often not useful for, at least for the employee, like in those situations. That's why one of my big recommendations is try and at least get status updates out of one-on-ones, because that's usually the big thing that happens, is that bosses use it as a chance to ask questions about things that they don't understand, where they don't know where project is at or why a decision was made or whatnot. I have a template on my website for that, but you can even start with a basic status update. I know people don't like writing status updates, but take it as a good exercise, because learning to communicate how stuff is going, like that's how careers work. Like that's just the nature of having a job. And so send a weekly email or have a shared document with your boss where you send them an update on where things are. You may still get questions in your one-to-one from them, but it will help you build a report over time. It will help them get better visibility, and it will give you a mechanism to understand better how your boss works. And so that's a big piece of making one-to-ones more useful. I would say, to the feedback piece otherwise that I mentioned earlier, like a lot of people struggle with getting good feedback from their bosses. An underlying issue there is that most of us are not good at conveying expectations. That's just, it's the human condition. I see you nodding. You're the psychologist in this conversation, but like we struggle either because it's hard to say things in the abstract. Many bosses are also scared of forgetting things when they, when you ask, oh, what do you expect from me? So having, for example, those written reports over time, having things like conversations about how's our work together going, all of those things can be really important puzzle pieces in ultimately getting to what is expected of me, what does doing a good job look like, and sort of finessing that over time.
And I guess the other thing that's relevant to mention there is it's also about picking the timing.
Say more.
Well, bosses are busy, right? They've got a lot of pressures, and we may want immediate feedback, and it may not be appropriate because they just got too much on their plate. So it's trying to forward, where we don't have regular one-to-ones that are diaried, it's trying to get that time
Yeah.
in the diary, a quality piece
Yeah.
of time, not just 5 minutes, right? A
Yeah.
quality piece of time where we can share genuinely the progress or ask for the genuine feedback.
Yeah. I would even go so far and like take that with a grain of salt, but like I would say that like having a regular one-on-one should be a standard in your company. And if your boss is not doing that, like that is a problem. Is
And what
it like
frequency would you give to that from your experience?
it
What's a decent frequency?
de it's like, yeah, depends, but this is the first time I'm saying depends today, so I get that I get that one. I would say like every 2 weeks should be doable, even if it's every 2 weeks, half an hour, but that would be a decent start. Whether they're supposed to be weekly or whatnot is a preference, but I would not recommend monthly because there's just too much going on in a month. And then the context is lost and you're just kind of starting over. It's like every 2 weeks, half an hour is kind of a good start.
Good. And I kind of call that touchline coaching. So we're regularly in
Yeah,
touch, but we're just nudging things along. But
yeah, nice.
formal reviews, would you recommend them to be quarterly or annually?
I mean,
It
back
depends,
to
right?
hot takes territory. No, no, not even that. Like this, where we're back to hot takes territory. Like performance reviews are typically quite pointless. Like they're an exercise that everyone goes through because the company mandates it, because ultimately the goal is to make sure that, well, yeah,
We're
whatever.
ticking
But
boxes.
like, and so like there are, of course, companies that are trying to genuinely make those useful and use it as a mechanism to get people useful feedback. But they just don't really work that way because the incentives are all messed up for that purpose. And so like, if ultimately you want to make sure that you have a written record on a regular basis of how you're doing and that you're doing a decent enough job to continue being employed or, get a raise or something, then like more frequent is good. I do think something like every 6 months or maybe even every quarter can be helpful because it keeps a bit more lightweight. But again, like it really depends on how performance reviews are used in your company.
Sure. But I
Yeah.
think, I guess if you only get one chance every 6 months to change your behavior, that's going to be very
Yeah,
difficult.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. I mean, like I've also like I work with companies now that are doing them every 3 weeks or every month. So like there's a lot going on in that space.
Sure. I can see Steve nodding his head here, and I'm fairly sure there's some questions coming in, Lena. So if it's okay with you, I'm going to ask Steve to step forward and invite Steve to come and ask some questions from his perspective and to field some questions that I'm sure are coming in from the community. Lena, thank you so much so far.
Thank you, Andy.